I spent more time than usual in the shower when I finally got home. It had been a long day. My mind felt foggy and exhausted. The hot water helped. Once I dried myself off, I headed downstairs for my nightly pre-bed ritual. Veg in front of the news, catch up on the headlines, then get some much-needed sleep. But today, it was all wrong from the start. To begin with, the main news anchor was someone I'd never seen before. Some smug-looking blonde guy who introduced himself as Hugh Ogelte. Must have been his first day, I guessed. Although, if it was, he spoke with the confidence of someone who'd been doing the job a lot longer. Hugh rattled through the main global headlines, the ongoing political mess, escalating foreign tensions, but I wasn't really paying attention. I was waiting for the latest on a different story, a story closer to home. One that's pretty much been the only topic of conversation among my friends and colleagues over the past week. And sure enough, Hugh didn't disappoint. Swiveling in the chair behind his desk, he stared straight into the camera and cleared his throat. As he began to speak, I felt a familiar dread building in my stomach. Police are expanding their search for the so-called meat cleaver killer after the body of a third victim was discovered on late Tuesday afternoon. This has been the latest in a string of horrific murders that have plagued the... I listened as Hugh reeled off the background to the case. I knew most of the facts already. Ever since the first death had been reported on a road not far from our office, it had been all anyone could talk about. Theories about the killer, grim details not available in the papers, rumours of severed limbs and dissected bodies, non-stop gossip and updates, non-stop fear. I guess a serial killer is always going to be a big talking point, but when the murders are happening in your area, it's different. You don't just feel like a distant observer anymore. You start to feel unsafe. It was as this thought crossed my mind that something happened. Something I was unable to explain. I couldn't make sense of it at the time, and I suppose I still can't. It made me feel like I might be losing my mind. The camera zoomed up for a close-up on Hugh's face. He stared back into it, his blue eyes unblinking. When he next spoke, it was as if he were addressing me directly. Police are advising residents in the area to take extra care when walking home, especially after dark, and to avoid quiet and poorly lit places at night. And if your name happens to be Sam, we'd advise you to take extra care. Now, onto the weather. I blinked and stared at the screen. Had I really just heard what I thought I heard? Had Hugh Ogelte just said my name? It couldn't be. Of course it couldn't be. I was tired, that was all. Exhausted from a long day. I'd been struggling to sleep lately, and it was probably just catching up with me. At least, that's what I told myself. But no matter what excuses I made, something was wrong. I knew it was. The sense of dread I'd felt when Hugh Ogelte began his broadcast sat in my stomach like a stone. I picked up the remote and flicked off the TV. Then, after a moment, I picked up my laptop. In the age of live streaming and catch-up, there was no need for me to overthink this. I'd obviously just misheard Hugh, and by going onto the news channel's online stream and rewinding it a bit, I'd be able to prove it. I navigated to the site and found the live feed, dragged the little marker back a couple of minutes. As I watched Hugh Ogelte launch into his roundup of the headlines again, I felt butterflies in my stomach. But not too many. I was pretty sure watching back the footage would set my mind at ease. It was a mistake. That was all. A simple case of tiredness and fear catching up with me. I'd heard something that wasn't really there. This time, as Hugh rounded off his segment on the meat cleaver killer, I leaned in close to the screen, watched as the camera zoomed in on his unsmiling face, and as he began giving his safety warning, I held my breath. Police were advising residents in the area to take extra care when walking home, especially after dark, and to avoid quiet and poorly lit places at night. And if you happen to be in the house on your own, then whatever you do, Sam, don't look under the bed. Now, onto the weather. I slammed my laptop shut, threw it on the sofa next to me. I was breathing fast, and I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. There were no excuses I could make this time. None. I'd listened carefully, I'd concentrated, and I was absolutely sure I hadn't misheard anything. Hugh's advice was different to the first broadcast, but it was clear enough. Whatever you do, don't look under the bed. From upstairs, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard. I froze. Every nerve in my body suddenly tingled. I held my breath and stayed as still as I could, straining my ears over the sound of my pounding heartbeat. Nothing. No more noises, no more creaks. You're imagining it, that's all, I told myself. All of it. It's just your tired mind playing tricks on you. But I suddenly found a horrible image pushing its way into my head. The image of a man upstairs, hiding in the darkness, his eyes and teeth glinting in the shadows beneath my bed. His fingers tightened around the wooden handle of a meat cleaver as he waited for the sounds of my footsteps on the stairs. I shook the image off. My hands felt hot and sweaty. As I picked up my phone in a desperate attempt to distract myself, my fingers slipped across its screen. I unlocked it on the third attempt, had to wipe my right end of my jeans before the thing would recognize my thumbprint. With the screen unlocked, I tapped on a random news app without thinking. A list of stories appeared in front of me. My eyes scanned down it. This was more like it. The top of the app was filled with the entertainment news and celebrity gossip, mindless stuff. As I scrolled down past the latest headlines, my heart gradually began to slow. I started feeling less afraid. But of course, it didn't last. About halfway down the page, I came across a headline that read, "Meat Cleaver Killer Claims Third Victim as Police Widen Search." I scrolled quickly past it, and as I did, that same creeping dread began to shift and roll in my stomach once more. Because it was happening the same inexplicable stuff I'd seen on the TV and on my laptop. The next headline that caught my eye was this: "Police advise residents who live alone to leave the house as quickly as possible." The one directly below it read, "Is the meat cleaver killer closer than you think?" And finally, just below that one, "Whatever you do, Sam, don't look under the bed." The name of that last article's author was Hugh Agelte. I locked my phone and placed it on the coffee table. My hands were shaking. Something fragile in my mind was starting to bend. It hadn't snapped. Not yet, at least. But it was close. I could feel it. Close to the breaking point. And as I sat there on my sofa, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had to go upstairs and check the bedroom. I had to do what the news was telling me not to do. Because there was no man hiding under the bed, really, was there? It was all in my mind. It had to be. It was paranoia brought on by fear and lack of sleep. I stood up and walked to the bottom of the stairs. They stretched up into darkness. My skin felt itchy with sweat. My heart beat like a trapped animal in a cage. I strained my ears for any sound upstairs, any more creaking floorboards, but I couldn't hear a thing. So I began to climb. The walk up the steps and down the hall to my closed bedroom door felt like a dream. I didn't want to go in that room, not at all. I knew there was nothing to be afraid of, not rationally, but the thought didn't help. Dread consumed me. Despite how I felt though, I couldn't see any alternative to confronting it head on. I took a breath and pushed open the bedroom door. It creaked inwards. My room was a nest of shadows. The curtains were drawn across the window, and the darkness made everything look sinister. My wardrobe and chest of drawers hunched in the blackness like monsters ready to pounce. I reached around the doorway, my hand shaking, and flicked the switch. Light spilled into the room. Its brightness made me squint. It banished most of the shadows, but not all of them. As I stood in the doorway, quickly scanning the area for any signs of movement, my eyes came to rest on the bed, at the slithers of darkness just visible beneath it. My bed rested against the wall at the far end of the corner, a nice big double. From my current angle, I couldn't see underneath it, not properly. I knew I'd have to go in for a closer look. The floorboards creaked as I moved across the room. Each sound made me wince. The dread in my stomach rolled and churned. My mind continued to bend beneath an enormous weight of fear. And as I got closer to the bed, something started to happen. All the unusual things I'd heard and seen in the news began rushing through my head. A barrage of words and sounds. The longer it went on, the more a strange conviction grew in my mind. That I was seeing the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't quite managed to fit together yet. A puzzle that it might be better if I didn't solve. If your name happens to be Sam, we'd advise you take extra care. Is the meat cleaver killer closer than you think? Whatever you do, don't look under the bed. The words whirled faster and faster in my mind. I was standing in front of the bed now. As the dread and terror inside me reached the crescendo, I lowered myself to my knees, and I peeked under it. Click. The final piece of the puzzle suddenly slotted into place. Hugh Ogelte, the news anchor I'd never seen or heard of before. I said his name again in my mind, more slowly this time. Hugh Ogelte. Hugh Ogelte. As I spoke the syllables and peered into the shadows beneath the bed, I felt a fragile part of my mind tear in two. There was no man hiding in the darkness. There was only a plastic bag. And as I reached into the shadows and grasped a hold of it, I already knew what it contained. I pulled the bag out into the light. I heard it scrape across the floorboards, took a breath, and opened it. Inside was a stained meat cleaver and the bloody, severed stumps of 3 fingers. There was a loud knock on the door, and my 8-year-old half-lab, half-mutt Macy started barking. I answered the door to a man in a police officer's uniform. "What is it tonight, Frank?" I said. "Is Officer Thomas to you? he said as he lowered his hand towards his gun. You better shut that dog up before I do it for you. You know she's tame and won't bite anyone, I said as I reached for her collar and put her in the bedroom. Sorry, Officer Thomas, I said. I didn't know you were on duty. Quit being a smartass, he said. Being a police officer is a 24/7 job. I'm always on duty, unlike you and your crappy office job where you work a few hours and are off every weekend. 24/7? You must get some killer overtime then, right? I said. You know what I meant, said Frank. What did I do this time, Frank? I said. Are you going to try and write me a ticket for illegally parking in my own driveway again? The judge loved that one. You mowed your lawn when you knew I would be sleeping, he said. You think it is funny I have to be protecting your sorry ass on hardly any sleep. I'm not going to warn you again. Are you threatening me? I asked. You are really here because I mowed my yard at 9 AM before it got too hot outside? Why don't you just move already? He said, with a smug look on his face. Move? I said. I've been living here longer than you. This was my grandparents' house, who left it to me. You are the one who should move. Everything was perfect until you moved into the neighborhood. You need to move because I don't like living next to you, he said as he walked away. You need to check with me before you mow your lawn. I need my sleep since I am a police officer. I slammed the door shut and lifted my middle finger into the air. Goddamn asshole. Then I went and let Macy out of the bedroom. 4 years of this nonsense. 4 long years. When he first moved in, I thought having a police officer next door would be a great thing. It might make the neighborhood safer since he would park his police car outside every night. And I used to think that someone who put their life on the line every day to protect people from the bad guys would be a respectful person and someone I would love to have as my neighbor. I could not have been more wrong. He thinks he runs the entire neighborhood. I have never met someone who is a bigger asshole than he is. He thinks that just because he is a police officer, that he has authority over everyone at any time. Even worse is, he isn't completely wrong. If you get on the wrong side of a police officer like him in this small town, he can and will make your life a living hell. It started as soon as he moved in. First, it was my dog crap in his yard one time. I even bagged it up when it happened, but that wasn't enough. Eventually, I had to build an 8-foot high privacy fence to keep Macy from accidentally crossing his property line. I didn't have the money, but if it would shut him up about having my dog sent to the pound and put to sleep, it was worth it. That dog is my best friend. Then he complained that she barked too much when she was outside and he couldn't sleep. Macy is your typical dog. She isn't a puppy and only barks when someone knocks or the UPS truck goes by. She is not a loud dog and only goes out a few minutes at a time as she's an indoor dog. It's not just my dog, but he always finds something to be an asshole over. My car is too old. My yard needs to be mowed, but only when he allows it. I hate him. He hates me. I know he hates me. The only thing he hates more than me is the crows. And that is exactly why I feed the crows every single day. After he left, I let Macy out of the bedroom and went to the backyard to feed the crows. Feeding them always made me feel a little better when he would tick me off. Frank hates crows. He loved to garden before he moved here, but can't because the crows always eat everything he plants. He has tried everything to get rid of them, like a scarecrow, putting out poison, even trying to shoot them, but nothing works. What started as a petty act of revenge to get the crows to stay in our neighborhood to tick him off has actually turned into something I enjoy. After a while, you start to recognize individual crows. They all look like the same at first, but eventually you see some physical differences as well as some personalities. It is said that crows are some of the most intelligent birds in existence, and they never forget a person's face. After a few years of feeding them, I believe it. Crows are some of the most amazing animals in the world. It is just pure luck Frank also hates them. My favourite bird is one I named Franklin. I named him that because no matter how big of an asshole Frank is, having my favourite crow named Franklin is just my way to make sure the name Frank is associated with something good. It is dumb and passive-aggressive as hell, but it is little victories like this that help me not let Frank beat me. Franklin sits on a telephone pole outside my yard every day. Morning and night he sits and watches. When I put the food out, he's always the first to eat. The other crows yield to him, at least when it comes to my yard. Sometimes he even brings me body parts of animals he's killed. At first it was weird, but I realized it was a gift. Kinda like I feed him my food, so he's sharing his food with me. It is pretty cool in a morbid type of way. He is my crow. She's dead. Macy is dead. That asshole killed her. He killed my best friend. I could tell something was wrong with her and got her to the emergency vet as fast as I could, but I wasn't fast enough. The vet did everything he could, but she was poisoned. The vet suspects she was given antifreeze. Apparently it tastes sweet and dogs will drink it. I don't know how he did it, but there was no doubt it was him. He has gone too far this time. I have got to do something. I went over to his house and banged on his door. He answered the door with a smirk on his face. "What do you want?" he asked. "You killed her. You bloody killed her," I said. "I know damn well it was you." "I haven't killed anybody," he said. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You killed my dog," I said. "What proof do you have?" he smirked. "And what are you going to do about it?" I didn't say a word. I just stared daggers into his eyes. It took everything I had not to punch him in his face. I would have done it too, if he wasn't jacked up on steroids, and would have loved, more than anything, for me to give him an excuse to beat the crap out of me, and then put me in jail after. "You should go down to the station and fill out a police report. Since you are my neighbour, I will look into this one myself. I'll give you the special treatment you deserve." He laughed before shutting the door in my face. Goddamn asshole. There was nothing else to do except to go home. He won again. He always wins. I always thought once I grew up the bullying would stop. The bullies would eventually move on and become adults and get over whatever inferiority complex they had. But I was wrong. Some bullies grow up to become asshole cops and use their position to continue to bully others around they don't like. I grabbed a beer out of the fridge and went outside to feed the crows. I wouldn't be lying if I said I didn't cry. I broke down. She was my best friend and didn't deserve to die that way. I was alone without her. She was all I had that I truly cared about. I looked up from my seat, and on the other side of the porch, perched on a chair, was my crow, Franklin. He had never came this close before. He didn't move. He just sat and watched me. It was like he knew what happened or noticed Macy was gone and came to comfort me. And he sat, perched on the chair, watching me. I waited for him to leave, but he didn't. He just stayed. He killed her, Franklin. He did it. I know it with all my heart. He is the one who would do something like that. I even thought about putting up security cameras, but didn't. Maybe she would still be alive if I had. I poured my heart out to the crow. He didn't move. He didn't make a noise. He just sat there like he was listening to me. Somehow, I needed this. He won, Franklin. I have to move. I can't live next to the asshole who murdered my best friend. I'm sorry. I'm gonna miss you, buddy. I wish someone would kill that asshole for what he did. He deserves it for what he did to us. Franklin cried out aloud, "Cry! Cry!" Then flew back to his post. I finished my beer and decided to go in for the night. The next morning I slept in late. I didn't really want to get out of bed and face the day at all without Macy by my side, but I forced myself out of bed anyways. I went to brew a pot of coffee and glanced out the window where I could see that asshole, Franklin, outside in his backyard, tending to his crappy garden. He was clearly ticked off and cursing at the crows who had destroyed his garden again. It gave me a little smile and a much-needed laugh to know my crows had taken something away from him. I poured my cup of coffee and went and sat outside on my patio. I looked up and Franklin was in his spot. I glanced around the sky and saw crow after crow sitting on the telephone lines, and then even more crows flying in the sky above. I've never seen so many crows before in my life. Never this many in my backyard area. It was like every crow in our state had congregated outside my backyard. Frank must have seen the same thing, because he was still in his backyard, yelling at the crows. I looked back at Franklin, who was still staring at me. He gave a loud cry and flew off his spot towards Frank's yard. The other crows near him followed after. I heard Frank scream, "Ah, goddamn birds! Ow, what the hell?" I looked back, and more crows were now flying down into his backyard, making loud screeching sounds. I couldn't see what was happening, but I could hear his screams. The sky was filled with crows swooping down, attacking Frank. It looked like a sea of black as the sky was filled with more crows. Where did all these crows come from? On and on the waves of crows would go into Frank's yard and then fly off before the next round would go down. The privacy fence was too high for me to see the carnage on the other side, but his screams were bad enough. Finally, the screaming stopped. Almost as soon as it had started, the sky turned back from black to blue. The only sound I could hear was Frank's wife crying and begging for help. I went around and took a look over Frank's backyard and saw what was left of him. His body had been pecked apart from head to toe. It no longer looked like a person as much as a bloody piece of roadkill. His face was completely pecked and eaten off. His body had been eaten down to the bones in some places. It had only taken a few minutes, but the crows had made short work of him. The sight would have made me sick if it was anyone but Frank. The ambulance and seemingly half the police department had showed up soon after. He was one of their own, but nothing could be done. He was dead. I went back home and grabbed a beer. I went out to my porch and sat down to enjoy this moment. A few minutes later, my crow friend, Franklin, flew up carrying something in his mouth. He landed on the table in front of me and dropped Frank's bloody eyeball. He nudged it towards me as he wanted me to have it as a gift. He looked at me and gave one loud cry, and I returned a smile. He flew back to his spot and stood proud watching. This must be why they call a large group of crows a murder. When I was young, my grandmother used to tell me stories about the island we lived on. She used to tell me about the fairies in the treetops, the spirits under the sea, the ghosts on the cliffs. But the story that stuck with me throughout my childhood were the stories about the demon in the woods, the Nightmaker. She used to huff and puff whenever I asked her to tell me the story. I was too young, she'd say. I'd have nightmares and keep her awake. She'd relent eventually, though. She always did. The stories went that there was a demon that lived in these woods, a thing who saw nothing in love or family. It would watch us from the dark with hateful eyes for all that was beautiful. The people who lived near the forest had to be careful. The Nightmaker had a black soul, and he would drive all to despair if you let him near. He had so many tricks, so many ways to torture the people of the village. No trick was played twice. Even survival was not enough. Meeting him even once would scar you forever, and you would end up taking your own life. The one thing that always struck me about the Nightmaker was how purposeless he seemed. He had no reason to do what he did. All he wanted to do was show the townspeople how horrible the world really was. At the end, cowardly little me would be shivering. My grandma would tuck me into bed. She'd kiss me on my forehead and tell me the world was cruel, but she would be there for me. The old woman cared for me. She really did. On my 10th birthday, she got me an old-timey radio. She knew how interested I was in tinkering in machines. If I could fix it, she'd give me a prize. I think that was what attracted him. 3 days after my birthday, after Grandma kissed me, I was tucked into bed when I heard a noise, a tapping on the window. On my bedroom floor was a shadow of a man. I looked up at my window. My father was smiling at me. It had been so long since I saw my father's face. I forgot what he even looked like. I thought he was dead, but at that moment, I recognized his smile. "Come on, kiddo, we gotta go to church." I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't care what he was talking about. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom window. As I did so, he held out his hand, beckoning me to come outside with him. Maybe he was taking me to heaven? He held my hand tight and I climbed out. Making sure I was okay, he led up to a path in the forest bordering on our house. We walked slow, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the extra time holding his hands. As we headed into the trees, I heard a melody echo around us. The singing was coming from deep within the forest, in the direction we were walking. It's a nice song, isn't it? I must have nodded, because his smile grew wider. It was getting colder as we walked, and the song was getting closer. Children were singing it, many, together. The trees, they were growing more twisted as we walked, their branches becoming more hand-like, like old men reaching out for me. His grip was so tight. His smile kept getting wider, stretching his skin as he stared into the dark. I gave slight resistance to his constraint. "Come on, John. We have to get to the church." "Dad, my name isn't John." His expression didn't change. If anything, his smile got wider. He raised one long, stretched finger and pointed it in front of us. "Look at the church." A cave in the distance. A cave in the middle of the woods. It led down into the earth. His cold grip pulled me as he led me, as I lagged behind him. This allowed me to realize a disturbing fact. His legs were run backwards. Whatever was holding my hand, it wasn't human. I jerked my hand away from him, stumbling back, ready to run. "Let's go inside the church, John." He turned to face me, and I screamed. The smile had grown and twisted the features of his face around it. His lips were ended around his eyes. So many teeth in a jaw that curved at me. The horrible grinning thing reached for me. I turned and bolted down the path. I glanced back to see the thing behind me, following me, walking at that same awkward pace, walking with those twisted legs. "I can see you." The tree branches snagged at my clothes, clawing at my skin as I pushed through them, leaving red marks as they cut into my face. The cold air turned into a rotted wind of stale air and pushed me back. It felt like hours, my time in that forest. Hours seeing that thing behind me. Hours hearing that tune. Hours struggling against the branches. All I could do was run. Away from the singing, away from the thing coming near me. When the light of my house came into view, I was about to collapse. My bedroom window, my grandma's house, my safe haven. I climbed in and locked the window after me. Crawling into my bed, I pulled my bedsheets up and waited, hoping to go to sleep or wake up from a nightmare. Slowly, after a few minutes had passed, I peeked out my covers to see a new shadow on my bedroom floor. It was there, standing outside the window. He was so horribly deformed now, a living, rotted tree smiling at me through the window, full black eyes and 2 red pinpricks in the center. It tapped on the window with those long fingers. "Let me in." I kept dead still. The finger pointed to the radio. It cackled to life. "Jack? Jack? John? Jerry? Come out, Jerry. Come out. You'll be safe with us, Jack. Come out." His voice. It was so wrong. It made me sick. "Come to the church. Open the window. Open the window. Open the window." "Go away!" The radio burst into a mad chant. "Open the window. Open 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 the window. Go away!" It stopped. For a moment. "One day, you're going to leave the window open, and I'll crawl in, and I'll remember what you did. I'll make you remember too. Open the window, and I won't hurt you." It stood, dead silent, waiting. A melody came from the radio. The same song I'd heard in that forest, from that cave. "Let's sing along, Jack." A horrible series of animal noises and shrieks echoed from the set. A woman in torture, a man laughing, all while the singing played. It was all such a horrible noise. My ears, they were being mutilated. Somewhere from upstairs Through that black cacophony, I heard a voice calling down. Jack? Jack, is that you? What's going on? The noises stopped. A frustrated voice came from the radio. Demonic howl. No presence of friendship left. You're going to be nothing. Nothing. You know where I see you in 10 years? I see you fat and dirty, hanging by a noose in your own room because you are so much of a failure. I was just sobbing at this point. Just go away. Please, go away. Let me tell you the truth, Jack. The world is horrifying. It is empty and dark. In the end, it won't even matter if you came with me or not. The voices started to fade, as did the shadow on my bedroom floor. You'll see that, Jack. You'll see that. My bedroom door flew open as my grandmother came in. She hugged me, but didn't say a word. She stayed by my side until I stopped sobbing and went to sleep. That night, I had a horrible dream. Something was holding my hand and dragging me through the woods to that cave deep within the forest. We went inside, and I saw the source of the singing. There were dozens of children, all naked and chained, lying on the cave floor. Their mouths moved up and down. All their chains led to a hole in the cave floor. As I stared into the hole, my twisted father emerged from the depths and reached for me. I jolted awake, trying to get away from that cold grip. It turned warm, and I saw my grandmother's face in the morning light. My grandmother had fallen asleep in a chair beside my bed. She was still holding my hand. Every night after that, for a week, she would stay with me. She wouldn't ask me what happened. It was like she just understood. I would never hear from my father again. Every so often, I'd be looking out the trees bordering on our house, and I'd see his face among the dead trees, smiling at me. One day, you're going to leave the window open. After the first time, I jammed the window lock, so it couldn't be opened. After that, life continued. Life went and hit me unprepared, like a turtle belly side up. Living was hard. I was alone a lot. After school ended, I went through the lowest point of my life. And I'm not about to go through my entire life story here, so I'll keep the details. But it was bad. Sometimes I could almost hear him. You know where I see you in 10 years. I see you fat and dirty, hanging by a noose in your own room because you were so much of a failure. This was the first time I'm admitting this to anyone. But there was a moment, I believe the words I heard that night, that I was going to end up in a noose. Through it all, even when I left the house, my grandmother would call me. She'd ask how I was doing, and I'd tell her I was all right. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel like a loser, having my grandma as my only friend in the world. But it got me through a lot of weeks on these phone calls. It was around 15 years later when I got the call. It was a doctor. She was sick. She'd been taken to the town hospital and was on life support. I got there within the night. It was there, on the white hospital bed. My grandmother let me know the truth. I wasn't exactly a planned baby. Her daughter, my mother, had been 15 when she met my father. He was a man, a trusted man of the town. She trusted her like an uncle. So it was easy to lure her into the trees where he would defile her. For 5 weeks after, my mother didn't say anything. It was only when it became too obvious, when she began to show, did she break down and talk to my grandmother. My grandmother wanted to call the police, but my mother begged her not to. My father was a horrifying man. She swore he would find her, even in prison, even in death. There was a fear so bad in her, she couldn't speak properly. She said he had promised her he would take care of her son, that he had a place in the woods for them to live in. Against the tears of her daughter, my grandma relented. They got married. The wedding took place in an empty church in the woods. For the next 4 years, my grandmother didn't see her daughter. When she did, it was sudden. She was bringing groceries when she saw a body lying near the edge of the woods. My mother was still alive, but just barely. She had lost so much in that time, so much hair, 60 pounds, 3 fingers. She still had me though. She held me tightly like a little life vest. Grandma had to pry her fingers open to get me some food. Over the next few hours, my grandma tried to get out as much as she could from her poor daughter. For half a decade, my mother had been dying in a nightmare. She wouldn't talk about where she'd been, only mutter about a church. She was broken in all of her spirit. Only the tiniest spark had still resided in her body by the end of it, the spark she had used to escape with me. She left him when he called me by the wrong name. My grandma finally called the police. She locked all the doors, closed all the windows, and let her family sleep in peace for the first time in years. It was only later she learned the true extent of the monstrosity her daughter had escaped. The cops had found the cave in the woods, my father's church. So many bodies, so many children, all chained, all dead. They were emaciated, but not all had died of starvation. The chains led to a dark pool where they found my father floating, naked, and smiling at them. They electrocuted him. My mother would never stop having nightmares. My grandma would wake to find her muttering in her sleep, talking of how scared she was of him, the nightmares she had of his corpse standing outside her bedroom window, asking to be let in. Near my 5th birthday, my grandmother thought she might have been getting better. She had grown quieter and more cheerful. There was a feeling about her that her suffering was about ended. On my mother's birthday, my grandmother brought home a small cake to celebrate. She found a daughter hanging from the ceiling fan. She told me of how helpless she felt that day. All her help had come so late. She had made up stories to deal with what happened. She knew she shouldn't have told me that story, the story of the Nightmaker, my father's story. It had been her way of coping. She didn't know it would have affected me that way, how it would scar me. She said she was sorry for it all. I looked at the woman who saw her daughter's abuser every time she saw me. I looked at the woman who had no reason to raise me, to not abandon me in the world. I kissed her on the forehead and thanked her for having loved me. There was so much I didn't say. How many times she saved my life, but I hoped it was enough. I held her hand and stayed with her till the day she died, 3 weeks later. I don't want to say anything good about this place we're born into. It's such a horrible, cruel place to live in. The world was cruel, but My grandmother made it so much brighter for me. Her eyes were like two pinpricks of light in the immeasurable darkness. The world is horrifying. That is the truth. Don't lose hope in each other. Sometimes it's the only thing keeping each other alive. Don't lose your goodwill. Don't lose your soul. Stay at home and go anywhere. That was the clever little headline that pulled me into all of this. I could almost hear the marketing department getting a raise. Neural empathy hardware is what it stood for. Just an innocuous post on a harmless messaging board. The body of the text detailed a device still in its testing phases that was searching for willing participants to try out the tech. I can't find the initial post as it has since been deleted, but I remember vaguely how it was structured. Are you a homebody? Is a quiet night in more appealing than subjecting yourself to the dangers of the world? Are you looking for an adventure without the cost or the risk? Then sign up as a gazer here and be connected to adventures all over the globe from the comfort of your own home. Are you an adrenaline junkie? Do you live your life between the trees or on top of the oceans and want people to experience all the wonders you do? Then sign up as a pioneer and allow others to view the world through your eyes. There's a big world out there, and you can help everyone see the best parts. It was one of those things I stumbled across that just screamed, "Too good to be true" at me. Even as I clicked the sign-up link, I was only asked my address. No monetary exchange was requested, and I was told that I'd receive my headset in a matter of days if I was selected. Another day went by, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that I had, in fact, been selected. My skepticism remained until I found a small white box, lacking any labels, sitting all alone on my front porch. I brought it inside and opened it to find a lightweight, sleek black device that looked fairly similar to a VR headset. Quickly, I read through the instructions and slipped the headset over my eyes. With a simple press of the button, the headset sprung to life, and my once dark view shifted into a graphic of the Earth rotating in space. There was a small whirring of fans that continued circulating air to keep my head cool, but other than that, the immersion was immediate. Noise-cancelling headphones also cupped over my ears, blocking out the outside world. I zoomed into the Earth and saw a plethora of dots littered around the landscape, each of them denoted with Pioneer, followed by a set of numbers. I could also see in the corner that I was designated as Gazer 64. Before long, I found a dot that was sitting near the coastline, and when I thought about how it'd be nice to see the ocean, my view closed in. Within the time it took me to blink, I was amazed to find I was looking out at a gorgeous crystal blue expanse of water. Pioneer 084 was just sitting within the sand and looking out at the ocean. It was incredible. You know how the mind can sometimes convince itself into feeling certain sensations? My mind was going into overdrive with that. The view on my end was so pristine and clear that it was as if I was really seeing it with my own eyes. The noise from the gentle winds and the shifting waves poured into my ears. I could feel the wind, cool but comforting, and I could smell the salty aroma the ocean was giving off. I was there. I had forgotten that I was wearing a headset and was all but completely convinced that I was sitting on a beach. The only thing that was anchoring me into the reality that I was sitting on my couch was my desire to see more. With the span of 2 hours, I went stargazing with Pioneer 014 and bike riding through the thick wilderness with Pioneer 225. Each and every dot that I decided to visit would take me somewhere new and fantastic. I've never been skydiving or cave exploring, but I felt my heart racing as I plummeted from the sky, or heard the cool dripping of water as I've explored dark caves. The implications of this technology and how flawless it operates could potentially change the world and how we interact with it. The idea of getting home from a long day at the office and being able to relax in a natural hot spring within minutes is elevating. This is, of course, if we lived in a perfect world. There's always something though, always a sinister implication that exists just beyond the visible veil. I discovered this when I tuned into Pioneer 004. It was getting late, and I only intended to visit a few more places to see some nightlife. I saw a dot that was pretty isolated from the rest that was in the middle of a densely wooded area. My curiosity pulled me into it like an addict. It was dark. That was to be expected given the time of day, but it was so dark that I was momentarily convinced that my headset had turned off. I was reaching up to take the headset off, taking it as a sign it was time to get some rest, when I heard his breath. It was muffled, like he had his hand up to his mouth, and with a small movement, I realized he was behind a tree. His face was close to the bark, so there wasn't much light to be had, but when he moved his head to peek out from behind the tree, I could see the moonlight bouncing around the forest. Even though I initially just assumed he was walking through the woods, I got the sensation in my chest that I did when I watched the more extreme pioneers, an anxious shaking. He continued moving his head from behind the tree and out again, like he was trying to catch a glimpse of something. All the while, his ragged breath was broken up by small whimpers. With the calming of his breath, he placed his hand on the tree. I could see a glossy liquid covering it. Then he stepped out from behind the tree. When the forest was in full view, I could see a massive silhouette standing in a clearing between the trees. The moonlight landed on its body, standing nearly twice as tall as the pioneer, who had just stepped in the wrong spot. A branch that must have been crafted in a cliché factory broke under his foot, and the mammoth of a creature snapped its attention towards him. Bright and yellow eyes surrounded by dark brown fur was the last thing I saw of the creature before the pioneer turned and began to run. I could feel his shortness of breath as he frantically tried to navigate between the trees. All the while, there was an intrusively loud pattern of lumbering footsteps chasing behind him. The pioneer began to scream before being cut off. It was hard to make out, but the last thing I remember seeing from him was a tree approaching far faster than he could run. There was a message that apologized for the disconnection, and then I found myself staring at the graphic of the globe again. I sat there for a while, trying to take in what I had seen. Ideally, it would have ended there. Like I just had a gulp of medicine, I needed something to wash my palate with. So I clicked on Pioneer 160, and for a while I was in the middle of a dance club. People were having fun. It's what I wanted, but when I thought of my previous encounter, I couldn't help but feel something was missing. So I backed out and clicked another member. Nothing was out of the ordinary there, so I continued flipping through Pioneers, looking for something different. I found a number of oddities throughout this method. While I would occasionally come across a group of individuals that were ghost hunting or playing with witchcraft, there was only a handful of things that stuck out to me, that gave me that heart-racing euphoria of being close to something otherworldly without being actually close to it. like Pioneer 034. When I clicked on her, I instantly received the view of her hand laying palm down on a wooden table with what seemed to be a spotlight shining on it. She was using a knife in her other hand to stab at the wood between her spread fingers. The speed of her stabbing was increasing when she looked up. The intense light made it difficult to see anything but black beyond. I heard her whisper a soft plea that echoed into the vast darkness. When there was no reply, she looked back down at her hand and began to stab at it once more. I could tell by the stained colour of the wood and the scrapes of the red marks along her fingers. This was a game she was losing. As I watched her, I could feel my fingers recoil every time the knife got a little too close. Then there was Pioneer 067 through Pioneer 070, a group of 4 people that I could quickly switch between. They all sat around a busted up poker table, looking at each other, and in the middle of the table was a gun. One pioneer at a time would pick up the gun, point it at the other person, and pull the trigger. 4 times I heard the gun click onto an empty chamber. It took a few times switching back and forth between them to realize that they weren't alone. Each of them had someone standing behind them, tall, cloaked figures. I could only see the bottom half of their faces, but they were wearing some kind of mask. Then, I heard the gun click a 5th time. The 4 pioneers sitting down had tears running down their cheeks as the gun was picked up once again. I couldn't stomach sticking around to see what happened next. Pioneer 119 was in a bright room, almost medical in appearance, if it wasn't for the woman that was bound by shackles in the corner. The pioneer watched her squirming around and messing with the metal that was around her ankles. He then called out to her. She looked at him in response. When I could see her eyes, the pioneer pulled a gun out, and before I could react, he shot the girl 3 times square in the head. Her body went limp, and blood started soaking her hair and spilling onto the white tiles underneath her. Then I watched as her body started to shake violently, and then she looked back up at the man with a furious gaze. I could see the bullet holes in her head, but there she was, snarling at the man who shot her, snarling with rigid and pointed teeth. I left them there. Some of the other things I saw had less to do with the world beyond ours, and more to do with the mishaps of our lives. I watched through the eyes of a woman who was frantically trying to escape from her car as it filled up with water. I could almost taste the murky water on the tip of my tongue. Then I watched a family of 5 at dinner together, but I watched from outside their dining room window. I also came across a ground of people moving through a large open field. It was the dead of night, but not a single one had a source of light on them. They were all dressed in flowing black cloaks, and whenever I caught a good look at a face, it was obscured by a mask. Their walking went on for several minutes, and while they didn't do anything, the sheer number of them and the silence they moved in set my nerves on edge. There was a pioneer who was operating on a patient in a room that seemed far less medical than the one I had previously seen. When he brought the knife across the patient's skin, I could see a brown liquid ooze out. He reached into the wound he created and pulled back, and within his grasp was a small clump of what looked like black hair. But the mass was moving like it was constructed of hundreds of tendrils. I wanted to stop, but I told you how the brain can convince itself that it is feeling sensations that it's not. No matter how many times I managed to click the power button and slip the headset off my head, I would still feel the urge to put it back on. Within hours, I would be back at it again. I'd forego sleep or eating to get another glimpse into what is going on behind closed doors. I watched Pioneer 354 sitting in front of a mirror, speaking to it seductively, all the while she pressed hot iron into her body like it was nothing. The feeling of my flesh searing sent a rush of adrenaline, just like skydiving had. Pioneer 094 slowly and methodically removed his eyes. I watched the entire procedure, and when he was done, I saw his face. Everything was there, including the holes where his eyes once were. His laughter was astounding. It's all out there. A beautiful world that is twisted up and spit out by absolute absurdity. Aliens, cryptids and ghosts. Even the darkest parts of humanity. I've seen it all. I've been through it all, and I've felt each and every bit of it. But it isn't enough. The more of it I see, the less of it that gets to me anymore. I'm becoming desensitized to the nonsense I'm witnessing, numb to the cries for help coming from the women bound as sacrificial altars, numb to the bizarre creatures I observe within the confines of government facilities. Luckily for me, every time I backed out and watched the world spiraling around in that dark void of space, I saw a little message. It was a small box of text, asking one simple question. Would you like to be a pioneer? I answered the call, and now I'm waiting for another white box to wind up on my doorstep. Then I will try my best to show people what this world really has to offer. So when this product officially launches and you find yourself laying back on your couch, enjoy your stay with where you ever choose to be. If you ever want to see something incredible, come find me. Pioneer 310, and you can sit back, relax, and go anywhere. No, please, Doctor, don't. For the love of God, don't play that tape again. You'll kill me, I screamed. The sound of lightning and thunder isn't going to hurt, my psychiatrist chuckled. He was completely bald, with a full white beard and an unsettling twitch in his right eye. Especially now. You're safe, so take a deep breath, lean back, and just enjoy being on my couch. He rewound the ancient reel-to-reel tape, preparing to again unleash the hellish crash and boom that caused me, a full-grown man, to cower with fear. The nightmare cacophony had transformed me from a healthy boy of 6, electrified by the imminent return of my long-absent soldier dad, into the haunted wretch I am today. You have no idea what this sound does to me, I yelled, pulling against the thick leather restraints. I was strapped to the plush designer couch, heavy black belts clinched painfully tight over my wrists and ankles. Even my head was restrained, leaving me with no other option than to stare helplessly at the fly buzzing around my nose. Oh yes, I do, the psychiatrist answered, the shrink I'd been assigned to under the government insurance plan for indigents. Even brilliant, overqualified indigents like me, brought to their knees by mental distress. Which is why I had you undergo desensitization therapy. Exposing you repeatedly to the noise complex that distresses you should have reduced its ability to unnerve. After 27 exposures, a thundercrack should now just be that, a thundercrack, not an apocalyptic event that threatens your very sense of self. But you have not improved. You remain a disturbed man. Therefore, I'm going to subject you to an experimental procedure I've dubbed Desensitization Therapy Plus. I sensed initial befuddlement when I asked you to bring along audio tapes of your family's voices. The tapes, you said, helped calm you when you were in crisis over past traumatic events. Well, now, You're going to find out why I asked. For your 28th treatment, I'm going to play those calming voices in one channel while continuing to transmit thunder and lightning sounds through the other. Though the treatment will again be a painful experience, the psychological halo of the calming voices will, when all is said and done, negate the troubling noises, essentially neutering them. I pushed against a restraint, but it was useless to even try. The leather straps were thick, and my entire body was in full view. There was no way I could try to break free without the psychiatrist stopping me as soon as I began. So I gave up, saving my energy for a better time to strike. "So, you really believe it'll work?" I asked. "The voices of my family mean everything to me because of what we went through." Indeed, I played them in my earbuds when I meditated, an ever-repeating loop called from various sources of my mom, dad, and sister saying, "I love you." "DTP Plus," he said with a tight grin, "will free you to laugh at the lightning strike, run with joy through the hardest rain. You're not crazy, you're not mentally ill, as your previous therapist have maintained." He pointed to the stack of file folders spilling across his polished teak desk. "I've immersed myself in your case and can say, to use a decidedly non-clinical term, they were full of bullcrap. I'm a full-blown Ivy League MD, a psychiatrist. Those others were a bunch of low-grade master's degree social workers who wouldn't know the DSM-5 from a coloring book." He balled his hands into fists. "I know of what I speak. You, dear sir, merely suffered a childhood trauma that I am going to eradicate today with my groundbreaking technique." With that, he donned a pair of sound-deadening headphones, punched a button on the reel-to-reel, and twisted the volume dial to the far right. Into one ear came a furious storm. Into the other, the soft voices of my loved ones. The psychiatrist leaned back in his Emir's chair, opened a leather-bound notebook, and scribbled with a gold-cross pen as I shrieked in pain until drooling. I returned to the long-ago time when my childhood ended and my benighted adulthood began. Mommy, you're so mean. Why can't Darlene and I go out to play?" I shrieked with all force a 6-year-old could muster. My lips were flecked with spittle. I'd been carrying on so long. "There's a terrible storm coming. Can't you hear it?" Indeed I could. Distant lightning flashed, followed by an ominous rumble. But I was too excited to sit still. My father was coming home from the secret war today after months overseas. Scuttlebutt had it that he was among the 2,000 troops being transported back in the massive bellies of C-130s disguised as FedEx cargo planes. Reports had been sketchy due to what my mom called a news blackout. All I knew was the war was still a fierce one, with one side gaining the upper hand before the other seized it back. It was a grim, never-ending story told in flesh, blood, and steel. But today, I was joyful. Daddy's unit was flying back to our remote island home away from home, rotating out of the front line for overdue R&R. Thunder boomed, closer now. My mother ripped the living room drapes shut. I could no longer see out. The playground set in the front yard, the makeshift pitching mound where I stood tall when Dad and I played catch. Me throwing sizzlers, Dad behind the plate, flashing signs. 2 phantom World Series rings on the line. Dad had worked hard to make our assigned property a comfortable place, even though it was on an island without a name, in either the Atlantic or Pacific. That too had been censored for security reasons. "Get down to the basement, now!" Mom yelled. She was flustered but beautiful, her flaxen hair in an unravelling bun. a sky blue apron over a sunflower yellow house dress. She was the quintessential mom, always there for Darlene and me, even when she appeared sad, her childhood sweetheart facing death across unknown seas. I took Darlene's tiny hand in mine, a prematurely serious girl of 4. She depended on her big brother to keep her safe from the dangers that had been omnipresent from the day she had been born. Little did Darlene know, I needed her more than she did me. Her brave, upturned chin, her warm little hand. Wrapping her trembling body in my thin arms, muffling her quiet sobs, she infused me with strength, gave me a reason not to surrender to my own fears. An unholy thunderclap shook dust from the massive table at the center of my dad's basement workshop, piled high with cobwebbed hammers and saws, pining away for the touch of my dad's sturdy hands. Hiding below it, Darlene and I cringed. Mom clattered down the stairs. "Where are you two? Say something." "Here, Mommy," I answered, poking out a hand. "Thank God," she cried, crawling beneath the table, hugging both of us, cupping our ears. Mom and Dad were our ultimate protectors. Nothing could go wrong when wrapped within their arms. It was then the storm hit with a vengeance. The house shook. The rafters groaned, as if resisting powerful forces bent on tearing them apart. Brilliant lights flashed in the crack beneath the basement door. The adventurous side of me wanted to climb the stairs, rip the curtains away from the picture window, and behold the awesome spectacle. The cautious part, the real me, wanted nothing more than to remain within my mother's protective embrace. Another boom, the loudest yet. The lights went out. I could barely see my hands. And then Darlene announced, "Mommy, I need to go to the bathroom." "Try hold it, darling," my mother replied, obviously exasperated. Darlene squirmed. A warm liquid saturated my upper leg. "Too late, Mom," I said. "She's already going." Darlene whimpered. "I want to be a good girl and sit on the toilet." Okay, my mom said. "We can't have you feeling ashamed." She touched me on the shoulder. "Take Darlene to the toilet down here, in the finished part of the basement. Wait outside and don't wander." I grasped Darlene's hand. "Let's move, and be careful where you step." "I will," she answered. "And I'll hold it until we get there like Mommy wants. But please hurry." Using my free hand, I felt my way there, but not before nicking my index finger when I bumped into Dad's table saw. I felt blood weaving into my palm. In better times, when it wasn't storming, I would have shown it to my dad. The stream of blood, evidence that I could sustain terrible wounds and come out smiling. Now, it just hurt. "Okay, go," I ordered Darlene when we arrived at the modest bathroom. Gleeful, she raced in. "Don't lock the door," I warned, just as I heard the telltale click. "I'll be quick," Darlene said. I rattled the doorknob, then shrugged. If anything went wrong, if the door got stuck, I could easily batter it down with a shoulder. I leaned against the wall, killing time. It became eerily quiet, as if the storm had passed. Suddenly, I couldn't wait to go outside, see the damage it had done. Maybe when Dad got home, he would ask me to help him clear away a few felled apple tree limbs. I could show him my cut finger, which was bleeding better than ever before. I practiced throwing a slider. Strike one. "All done," Darlene, emerging from the bathroom, announced. I'd been so caught up in my fantasies, I hadn't even heard her. "Wait here," I said. "I need to go inside and dress my wound." I figured Dad would be even more impressed if I wrapped a thick wad of toilet paper around it that became soaked with blood. I closed the door behind me, figuring I'd take a leak too. The toilet paper dispenser was down to a few sheets, so I bent over to find another roll in the cabinet under the sink. Rummaging around blindly, I stumbled across a plunger, a can of Drano, a can of Raid, and assorted wrenches and PVC plumbing parts. But no damn toilet paper. Finally, I remembered that Mom kept the extra rolls in a plastic bag behind the toilet tank. Brushing away cobwebs and grit, I tore the bag open. Elated, I was wrapping my trophy wound when a silent boom knocked me off my feet. I hit my head on the floor, a staggering blow that made me instantly sick. Trying to stand up, I was brought back down by a chaotic drumbeat of similar booms, accompanied by the sound of massive hail crashing onto the roof. The storm had returned, intensified 100-fold. Swooning, trying to steady myself against any handhold I could find, I lurched out of the bathroom. "Darlene, let's go back to Mom," I screeched, blindly flailing my arms with the hope that I could find her, her shoulders, any part of her. But then I saw a rectangle of flashing light. The basement door was open. Darlene was upstairs. My mom staggered out of the darkness. She'd noticed the irregular lights too. Shocking white, and then black, and then back again. "What happened?" she asked, her fingers splayed over her mouth. "Darlene got away. I was taking her..." Stopping mid-sentence, I flew up the stairs. There was still time for the World Series hero to save the day. What I saw when I slid into the living room has shaped my life to this very day. The drapes had been pulled back. The view through the picture window, a hallucination of jagged silver streaks and snapping branches. And everywhere, massive objects were hurtling down from the sky, battering the muddy earth, forming craters. Then Darlene, her face pressed against the glass, turned to me and, with wonder in her voice, said, "Look, it's raining men." Indeed, torsos, limbs, and intact bodies were pounding down like human hail, caving the roof of the family car, pockmarking the corrugated steel roof of Dad's workshop until it collapsed of its own accord. Explosions rattled the firmament as enemy rockets burst the C-130s, spilling their precious cargo far and wide. Starting out as specks, the soldiers became recognizably human as they pelted the flattened landscape, spewing viscera and mud. "Oh my God," my mother cried. She raced past us, flung open the front door, and staggered onto the front yard, her arms upstretched as she turned around and around. "Mom, come back," I implored. "You'll get hurt." I hurried onto our covered porch, but couldn't bring myself to leave its shelter. A body pierced the roof above me, a uniformed soldier with a shredded scalp and ballooning eyeballs jolting to stop inches from my nose. His dress blues were littered with dangling medals. An insignia stitched to what remained of his right shoulder indicated he was a member of my father's unit. I sought refuge in the furthest corner of the porch, pressed my back against the wall, shut my eyes, and tried to make it all go away. Until Darlene shook me by my shoulder, pulled me by the hand and said, "Come see, come see." I followed, Darlene looking back every once in a while, her eyes alight, a big smile on her face, a wonderful like I seldom saw. "I have a big surprise, I have a big surprise," she chanted. Finally, when we reached the far edge of the porch, she stopped and pointed. "Daddy's home," she said. And there he was, my big, handsome dad, wearing his military best, lying in a heap atop a lifeless figure in a sky blue apron over a sunflower yellow house dress. No, no. Yes, Mom. My parents were locked in a final embrace, their broken faces fused in an eternal kiss. My mom's lips had been sheared off upon Dad's impact. From my vantage point, she appeared to be smiling. Then the audio tape stopped, and I emerged from my reverie. "And how does my favorite patient feel now?" the psychiatrist asked, his gin-soaked breath overpowering, his smug, bloated face just inches from mine. "No improvement," I struggled to throttle him, the thick leather restraints saving his life. "Don't jump to conclusions. Remember, I warned you that this session would cause the same unmitigated pain as the previous 27. The true test comes now in its aftermath. If my theory is correct, I can now play for you the storm audio in both channels, and you should suffer no harm." He leaned toward the reel-to-reel. "May I?" Still reeling from the last assault, I was not ready for another. But before I could object, the tape again rolled. The same earth-shaking blasts, the rumblings, reverberations. But I felt nothing. No childhood terror, no adult fear. Nothing but a feeling of wonder at Mother Nature's grand fury. "I'm cured," I bawled. "Cured! Cured! Oh, thank you, Doctor, for relieving me of eternal pain. You're a genius, a great man." Beaming, he said, "Hold on, we're not quite done yet." He rose unsteadily from his emu's chair and undid my straps. I sat upright, rubbing my swollen wrists and ankles. I felt faint blood draining from my head. So this was what it felt like to be a liberated man, able to acknowledge suffering while remaining on an even, emotional keel. "Put the headphones on again," the psychiatrist asked, holding them out. "Why? Didn't you prove that desensitization plus works?" "There's a finishing touch. I want you to listen to your family's voices again. It'll soothe out any kinks, cement your gains. I know that sounds like psychiatric gobbledygook, but any job worth doing is worth doing well." He was drinking Tanqueray openly now, straight from the bottle. But hey, I thought, he deserved to celebrate. "Whatever you say, Doc." I donned the headphones. He flipped on the recording, and from the first parental "I love you," I was in unbelievable pain. "I love you," said my mother, sister, and dad, each word like a .44 Magnum slug piercing my skull. I fought the urge to break the headphones in two, hoping the anguish would subside. But it continued until the loop ended and started again. "What the hell's wrong?" the doctor asked, tearing the headphones off me, throwing them aside. He finished off the gin. "I can't listen to my family talk without excruciating pain. And their voices, their precious voices, were all that kept me hanging on." I rose to my feet, now face to face with the stinking, slovenly doctor. How could I have allowed myself to be fooled by him? "Listen, young man," he said. "I informed you up front this was an experimental procedure, yet you decided to proceed for unbridled personal gain." "Personal gain? You mean to feel well again?" The psychiatrist took a wild swing with the bottle. "This can all be fixed if you just settle down. Obviously, what happened is an unexpected boomerang effect. You were desensitized to lightning and thunder while simultaneously developing an aversion to your family's voices. A novel sort of transference. It's a fascinating twist, actually, that warrants further investigation. He shattered the tankery on his teak desk, pointing the jagged end at me. "We're making history here, son. You and me." Adopting a messy fencer's pose, he lunged at me with a bottle. Missing, he began whipping it back and forth, nicking my finger, the same one that had been bloodied during the storm. Enraged, I slammed the reel-to-reel to his chest. He fell to the floor. I beat him senseless. The spools of tape kept whirling, going nowhere. I bent down, found his Brooks Brothers wallet, extracted $140 cash, the same amount he charged for a session, and said, "Hope you feel better now." I strode out his door and down the hall, past the other patients, beleaguered by unknown psychic maladies, waiting their turns. "The doctor might be a while," I informed them. "He's recovering from a heavy dose of anger therapy." I hit the street crying. Lord, was I going to miss hearing my mom, dad and sis? But in my heart and gut, I knew I would survive. For the first time ever. In a weird and unexpected way, Desensitization Plus had truly worked. When the psychiatrist recovers, I'll recommend him on Yelp. Have you ever walked in on your parents, how do I put this, getting personal with each other? Well, I did, and that's what pushed me over the edge to get off my fat ass and find a place of my own. Plus, I was 22 years old and working full-time, so it was definitely time for me to get a place of my own. After checking out multiple flats, one of which had its bathroom in the center of the living room, and no, I'm not joking, I found a bungalow advertised online, and the rent for the amount of space you got was a bargain. So, I called the letting agent and arranged for a viewing. But when I turned up to the property, I saw that it was a big house and not a bungalow. I chalked this up to a mistake on the website and assumed that the house was split into 2 flats. The lettings agent who was showing me around was called Sarah. She was about my age and extremely attractive. One thing I regret now is not getting a phone number when I had the chance. Once you open the front door, there was a door to the left, and straight ahead was a staircase with a red and white carpet going up, and at the very top was a bright red door. "Hey, Sarah, do you know anything about the upstairs neighbor?" She turned to me as she opened the door to the flat. "Honestly, all the documents we have in relation to the property states that this was a bungalow, but obviously we've been misinformed. I will understand if you no longer wish to view the property." To tell you the truth, the property could have been a studio flat, and I still would have asked for a tour, just so I could spend some time with Sarah. The pictures didn't do the flat any justice. After you walk through the front door, you're greeted by a short corridor that connects the rooms of the flat. The living room had multiple windows that let in the morning light. The kitchen was circular and was connected to the living room. The bedroom was big enough for a desk and a double bed. The ensuite bathroom was a little small, but it had a toilet, sink and shower, so I couldn't complain. While Sarah was giving me the tour, I kept thinking how quiet it was in the flat. I didn't hear the upstairs neighbor once the whole time I was there. Not even a creak from a floorboard. After some negotiating over the different terms and costs for the flat, we settled on a price, and by the following Monday, I had moved my meager belongings into the flat. That evening, I was sat on the floor in my living room. I didn't have a sofa yet, but at least I'd set up my TV. I was unpacking the last of my boxes when I started to hear footsteps coming from upstairs. I looked at my phone, and the time was 8:42. I'm honestly more surprised that this was the first time I heard movement upstairs. I couldn't help but wonder who my upstairs neighbor was. I may have been hoping it would be a hot 20-year-old who was looking to make some bad decisions with a new neighbour. Obviously, I knew I wouldn't be that lucky, but it's fun to wish for stuff like that. Then, as soon as the creaking began, it stopped. Then, there was only stomach-turning silence. I took a deep breath and went back to unpacking my stuff. After a couple of hours, I was finally finished setting up my new flat. I was completely exhausted and looking forward to being able to sleep in tomorrow, as I didn't have work. Something strange happened that night. I awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching coming from upstairs. I sat up in my bed and started rubbing the sleep from my eyes. An outside street lamp was shining through the gap in my curtains, illuminating a section of my bedroom. I looked up towards my ceiling, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw scratch marks on my ceiling, but when I turned on my side table lamp, they were gone. As I was up, I thought I'd grab a drink from the kitchen. The wooden floorboards of my living room was like walking on ice. The frigid air that hit me as I opened the fridge sent a shiver throughout my entire body and caused me to retreat backwards a couple of steps. As I stared into the empty and sad-looking fridge for something to drink, then there were 3 knocks at the door. I closed the fridge door, which shut with a clicking sound. I turned and walked over to the front door. As I unlocked the door, I thought I could hear someone breathing heavily on the other side. As I opened the door, I was greeted by pitch-black darkness of the entranceway. I took a couple of steps outside my flat, and I could still hear the heavy breathing. I looked around, hoping my eyes would adjust to the darkness, but there was no one around. In this small entranceway, there wasn't anywhere for someone to hide. My eyes became fixated on the top of the staircase. I didn't notice this when I visited the flat or when I moved in, but the door at the top of the stairs had no door handle. As I stood there, staring at the bright red door with no handle, I noticed the breathing had stopped, but what replaced it was a low moan. It sounded like it was coming from upstairs, but it was so faint that someone could have been standing right next to me, quietly moaning in my ear. Honestly, it felt like I was staring at the door for hours, but eventually I managed to pull my eyes away and headed back inside. I chalked it up to me being exhausted and stressed from the move. Once I was back inside my flat, I grabbed a glass of water and went back to bed. The next day, I finally got up around 10. I could hear the sounds of birds outside my window and the nearby traffic whizzing by. I couldn't help but smile that other people will be going to work today while I'm having a lazy day. I finally got out of bed and decided to have some Lucky Charms for breakfast. I walked into the kitchen, and the strangest feeling washed over me. It was like I was being watched. I looked around the kitchen/living room, and as expected, there was no one there. Again, I made the mistake of chalking it up to being tired from the move. I wish I wouldn't have been so naive. I sat down on my not-so-comfy floor and started flicking through the channels on the TV. Like usual, there was nothing of interest on. As I sat there eating my breakfast, the feeling of being watched became more dominant, and what felt like someone breathing heavily on the back of my neck. I spun around, causing my neck to crack in the process. However, there was no one there. I stood up and began frantically searching for the source of the ominous feeling of being watched. After 5 minutes of searching, I gave a small chuckle. I was being ridiculous. I lay down on the floor and stared at the ceiling. I froze. It looked like there was a face staring down at me. The face appeared to have long, messy hair and an even longer beard. His eyes were completely black, as though there was no life in them. I basically jumped up and ran to the front door, but as I turned around to take one last look at the face in the ceiling, it was gone. I rubbed my eyes and took another look at the ceiling, but the face was still gone. I grabbed my car keys and left the flat. As I walked out of my front door, I took a glance at the top of the stairs. There was a man standing in front of the door with no handle. He had long, messy hair which reached the base of his back. "Good morning, my name's Sam and I'm your downstairs neighbour," I said while standing at the foot of the stairs. The man didn't turn around, but responded in a deep and scratchy voice. "Stay away from my door." And with that, the door to his flat opened and he disappeared into the pitch black flat. What really sent shivers down my spine was that he opened the door without touching it. It just opened and closed by itself. I needed to clear my head, so I locked up my flat and went out for a drive, hoping it would calm me down. After a couple of hours, I came back to the flat. As I opened the door to the joint hallway, a freezing wind passed through me. It chilled every bone in my body. Taking another look up the staircase and fixing my eyes on the door with no handle, it seems as though the staircase had gotten longer. The longer I stared at the door, the more steps seemed to appear, creating what seemed like a never-ending staircase. I started to feel dizzy, so I decided to head into my flat and have a lie down. Once I entered my flat, I took a look at my ceiling, and there was no face looking down on me. I sighed, took a deep breath, and chucked my keys and jacket on the floor. After splashing water on my face, I collapsed on my bed, and soon sleep had claimed me. I sat bolt upright in my bed. A blood-coiling scream filled my ears. It was so high-pitched, I was sure it couldn't be coming from a person. It was coming from upstairs. I covered my ears with my hands, but it didn't help. I swung my legs up and got out of bed. When my feet touched the floor, the screaming stopped. Silence. I couldn't even hear my heart beating. It must have been a nightmare, I said out loud to myself, and sleepily walked over to the kitchen. I splashed some water on my face at the kitchen sink and poured a glass of apple juice. I chugged it all within seconds. Knock, knock, knock. 3 unusually loud knocks came from the front door, causing me to drop the glass I had in my hand. I managed to move my foot out of the way before the glass came smashing onto the ground. Whoever was knocking at this time of morning was about to feel my wrath. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks, which was somehow louder than last time, echoed around the flat. "I'm coming!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. "Whoever you are, you better have a good reason for knocking on my door during the middle of the night." I stormed over toward the flat door, unlocked it, and swung it open with a strength I didn't know I had. As I stared out into the pitch-black abyss of the hallway, I saw nothing and no one. I took a step outside of my flat. The outside door was locked. I scratched my head in confusion. As I turned to go back inside, my eyes caught a brief glimmer of light coming from the top of the stairs. The door at the top was open a crack. A loud crashing came from the flat upstairs, shortly followed by what sounded like a woman screaming. "Hello? Are you alright up there?" Silence. There was no response. "Hello? Please yell if you need help." Again, silence. I took my foot and set it down on the first step. My hair stood on the back of my neck and my body began to shake. I removed my foot from the step almost as quickly as I had placed it. Once my foot was removed from the step, my body stopped shaking and the hair on the back of my neck settled down. I looked back up at the door with no handle and saw it was open completely now, but the light was no longer there. I stood there, staring up the seemingly normal staircase. I knew I should have gone back in my flat and got back to bed. You're all probably thinking, "Don't go up the staircase. This is how most horror movies start." Well, you're all right. I shouldn't have gone up those stairs. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I began taking it one step at a time, fighting against my body, telling me to run away and that something was very wrong about the upstairs flat. The more steps I climbed, the more the feeling of dread and worry washed over me. My eyes never left the door at the top. It was my destination, and I had come too far to stop now. After what felt like forever, I reached the top of the stairs. Now I was only centimeters away from the door. I was able to see the door in more detail. The previous bright red colour was now a deep crimson colour, and it was like the door was melting. The door wasn't a solid colour. Instead, the door was covered in this crimson liquid. My feet began to feel cold and wet. I looked down, and my feet were completely covered in this liquid. After the liquid washed over my feet, it began flowing down the staircase, turning any sections of the carpet that used to be white into the deep crimson that seemed to cover everything in its way. I took a deep breath, and, while trying to avoid touching the door, I crossed the threshold into the flat. What caught my eye immediately was the lack of furniture. There was only a single chair in the center of the living room. Looking around, the walls looked like they were moving. In fact, the whole flat seemed to be moving, almost as though it was alive. I tried to find a light switch, but I couldn't see one. Honestly, I could hardly see anything. "Hello?" I tried to say it loudly, but what came out of my mouth was a whisper. My body wouldn't stop shaking, and I had to fight the very instinct not to run and jump down the stairs. "Hello?" I said again. This time, I was able to speak normally. There was no response. I started taking steps slowly, heading further into the flat. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart getting louder the more steps I took. I made my way over to the window at the other end of the living room, and I pulled open the curtain, releasing moonlight into the flat. As I stood at the window, I started to feel a cold wind on the back of my neck. I spun around, and I froze. I blinked a couple of times. What I was seeing couldn't have possibly been real. The walls were moving. Now, I don't mean they appeared like they were moving. I mean they were moving. It was like the walls were breathing. I could see them shrinking and expanding, just like a pair of lungs. I took a step backwards and fell against the window. Looking down, the floor was covered in the same crimson liquid as the door. Blood, the floor, the door, and even the walls had thick streams of blood flowing over it. I could feel the vomit begin to make its way up my throat. I gagged and tried to swallow it down, but I couldn't. As vomit started erupting out of my stomach, the walls began to move more rapidly. By now, my entire body was screaming at me to get out of this place. I tried to stand up, but my body had shut down in shock. "I told you to stay away from my flat." I looked up, and on the other side of the room, with long, messy hair and an even longer beard, was the face from the ceiling. The man on the other side of the room smiled an impossibly large smile, and then from the blood-covered walls started to emerge a person. The face's eyes never left mine as a hand, then an arm, started to push its way out of the wall. Within seconds, the full body of the man I saw yesterday was standing in front of me. Blood was dripping from his body, and it seemed like it flowed back into the walls, like the man and the flat was one, and not two separate things. "You should never have come here," the man yelled, and then the ear-shrieking sound I heard before began erupting out of the walls. The feeling of being watched rushed over me, and as my eyes began darting around the room, my eyes were met by more faces that seemed to emerge from the walls. There must have been at least 30 faces now covering all the walls of the living room. The faces looked scared and in so much pain. It was like they were asking for help. The ear-piercing scream that came from the faces got louder. I brought my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise. It didn't help. The screaming kept getting louder. The man started walking towards me, and the more steps he took, the louder the faces screamed. With a sudden rush of adrenaline, I clambered to my feet and charged towards the man. As my body hit his, there was no impact. Instead, my hands passed right through him. I tried to pull my hands away, but it was like trying to move underwater. Every movement took all of the energy I had left. The man just stood there, smiling at me. "I'm gonna add you to my collection." With that, he reached his arm out and grabbed the sides of my face. I had to fight to keep my eyes open and to stop myself falling unconscious. The man's hands began to envelop my face. I couldn't breathe. The blood was pouring into my mouth. As I felt the blood began to fill my lungs, the world started to go dark. "I can't die here. I can't die here." My eyes began wide and bloodshot as I started swinging my arms rapidly in all directions. My feet were still on the semi-solid floor, and with the last of my strength, I pushed my body through the man and came crashing to the ground. I was covered in the thick crimson liquid. I took a couple of deep, panicked breaths and turned my head to see the man's body beginning to reform itself on the blood on the floor. I didn't need to wait to see what would happen. Getting to my feet was like walking on ice. The floor was no longer solid. As I tried to run for the door, my feet were sinking into the new bloody quicksand that had replaced the floor. I pushed through. One way or another, I was getting out of this nightmare. I needed to make it out of this flat. Putting one foot in front of the other, I began wading my way to the door. The man called out to me in a mocking tone. I didn't turn around. I couldn't face him again. I just needed to get out. I was getting closer to the door, but at this point, I was swimming through the floor. It was starting to pour into my mouth. I tried to hold my breath, but I couldn't. I was now less than a meter from the door. I know it's sad, but at that moment, the image of Sarah appeared in my mind. I wanted to see her again. I knew that I wasn't meant to die here, and that I was going to get out of there. As I finally reached the door, the liquid became thick and almost impossible to move through. It was like the floor was trying to grab me, but it didn't matter. I pushed my hand through and grabbed the door frame. With the last of my energy, I pulled myself out of the room, causing me to fall down the stairs. As my head hit one of the steps, I fell unconscious. Wake up, Sam, are you alright? My eyes started to open. Everything was fuzzy, but there was a man standing over me. Here, let me help you to your feet. As I stood up, I realized I was outside. What happened? Who are you? I said while looking around. Where am I? Sorry, this must be confusing. My name is Daniel, and I'm the owner of this bungalow. I came by to take the water readings and found you passed out on the floor. Wait, did you say bungalow? But it's 2 flats. I gave him a confused look, and then I saw it. Behind Daniel was my flat, but it looked like a bungalow. Where's the 2nd floor? Wow, Sam, you must have hit your head pretty hard. This property has always been a bungalow. He gave me a concerned look. I couldn't believe it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Wait, what about the lettings agent, Sarah? She saw the upstairs flat as well. I'm sorry, Sam, but there is no one at the lettings agent called Sarah. I stood there, completely dumbfounded. I had no idea what was going on. After Sam took the meter reading, he advised that I should go see a doctor. But I know what I saw. Once Daniel left, I went into my flat, and where the staircase used to be was a brick wall. Once I opened the door to my flat, I went into the bathroom to clean up, and as I looked in the mirror, I noticed I still had some blood on my neck. What freaked me out the most, and what finally pushed me to move out of this flat and move back home, was because when I looked at the blood on my neck, it looked like a face was staring back at me. The office next to me has been empty for the last 5 years, until 10 days ago. I worked in the information technology department at a small hospital. My office sits at the end of a very long hallway with only one other office next to it. Like I said, it has been empty for the last 5 years. So you can imagine how shocked I was when I heard someone sneeze through the wall. I responded out of habit. Bless you. Then I sat straight up in my chair and turned to the wall with a look of shock written all over my face. I rolled my chair closer to the wall and listened for a response. When no one responded back, I picked up my office phone and called my supervisor. After speaking with her for a good 5 minutes, she convinced me that no one was hired recently, nor had anyone been placed in that office. She stated that the office next to mine has been unoccupied for so long because of a water pipe leak in the ceiling. I immediately looked up to make sure that no such leak was spreading over to my office. Once I assured myself that a ton of dirty ceiling water was not about to crash down on me, I got off the phone with her. I guess I was hearing things now. I rolled back over to the wall and listened again for a noise. Nothing but my own breathing was heard. I decided that I needed to get out of my office and go get some fresh air. And when I say fresh air, I mean a smoke break. I have to walk past the office next to mine to get to the exit. The door was closed as it always had been for the last 5 years. But now, there was light creeping out from under the door. I stopped outside the door and just stared, like a deer caught in headlights. After a few seconds, I saw a shadow pass by the bottom of the door. I instinctively reached my arm out and knocked on the door. The next thing I knew, the handle of the door was being twisted open, and this man was standing in front of me. He was dressed in all black from head to toe. His eyes were sunk deep into his sockets, and he wore a look of anger for being disturbed. "Hello?" I said. He continued to stare at me like I never said a word. "My name is Seth. My office is next door. I was not aware that we hired anyone new or that this office was being occupied." The man just continued to stare at me like I did not exist, and he could care less about who I was or where my office was located. "Okay, well, I just wanted to say hello and welcome you to the hospital. I work for the IT department, so if you need help getting your computer set up, give me a call." He continued to stare, so I took that as my cue to leave. After I finished my smoke break, I walked back up to my office. My mysterious neighbour had his door shut again. I shut and locked my door and called my supervisor to fill her in on my strange encounter. She was as thoroughly confused as I was to who this guy was or what he was doing there. She played it off that HR must have hired someone and she's not in the loop to be made aware of who he was. I got off the phone with her and went about my day as I normally do. A few hours went by, and I started to hear some strange noises through the wall. I rolled my chair back over there and started listening. This was a mistake. At first, it sounded like someone was humming, but it was muffled. The longer I sat there and listened, the more aware I became that it was not humming, but some sort of moaning. Not the sexual kind either. This was the kind of moaning you would expect to hear from someone that was in a great deal of pain. I immediately was creeped out, but could not keep myself from trying to listen. As I moved closer to the wall, I accidentally knocked off a picture. As it clattered to the floor, the moaning immediately stopped. "Oh crap," I said out loud. As quietly as I could, I picked up my displaced picture and hung it back up and quickly rolled my chair back to my desk. A minute later, someone was knocking on my door. Normally, I don't panic when someone is at my office door, but for the life of me, I could not get the feeling of dread out of my mind that the man in black was outside of my door. I slowly made my way to the door and asked who it was, while staring intently at the lock on my door to make sure that it was still locked. No one answered. I waited about 5 seconds and started to walk back to my desk when a loud knock about made me wet myself from fear. I gathered all the courage I had and unlocked my door and flung it open. The hallway was completely empty, and as I poked my head out of my doorway and looked around the corner, I caught my neighbour's door shutting. For whatever reason, this scared the hell out of me. I quickly closed my door and relocked it. I walked back to my desk and sat down and tried to regain some kind of composure to my shaking limbs. This is ridiculous, I thought to myself. He's just a man, nothing more, nothing less. I decided to go over and see what he needed. Perhaps he didn't see me earlier when he knocked on my door, and I did tell him if he needed anything to let me know and I would help him out. So, off I went. I walked over to his door and noticed the lights were out this time in his office. I proceeded to knock and wait for an answer. No one answered, but the door did slowly open. Looking in, all you could see was darkness. The blinds on the back window were closed tight, allowing very little to no light inside. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness before I went any closer to his office. Slowly, shapes started forming in my vision. I could see the outline of an old desk and a filing cabinet to my left. When I turned my vision to the right, I about screamed. Sitting next to the wall was what appeared to be a woman, tied up to a chair. Her head was hanging down at a disjointed angle to her body, and she was not moving. With all the courage that I had, I took a step into this office and quickly fumbled for the light switch that I was praying was on the side of the wall. Sure enough, my fingers found the switch, and once the light was on, I wished I would have kept it off. Sitting in the chair to my right was my supervisor, Cindy. Her chin was almost touching her belly. There was a massive amount of blood covering her chest, stomach, lap, and the floor beyond her. It looked as though there was a large wad of bloody meat sitting next to her on the floor. As my eyes took in this sight, my mind came to the conclusion that this must have been the missing part of her neck, which is why her chin was able to touch almost to her stomach. The moment my mind made this connection, my body leaned over to retch. The man in black, at the same time, jumped up from behind the desk from where he was hiding. I turned and couldn't control as puke-filled breakfast hit him straight in the face and luckily stopped him in his tracks. I turned on my heels faster than any former band geek should be able to and took off running back to my office. I slammed the door shut and locked it as fast as humanly possible. I ran to my desk phone and punched in 911. I waited for the operator to answer. Nothing. There was no dial tone. The man was slamming himself into the office door, and there was no way that my cheap lock was going to hold him much longer. The only other way out was through the window, but it was housing a humongous, out-of-date air conditioner at the moment. I quickly pushed my spare desk up against the door to hold this maniac off for a little bit longer. I picked up my office chair and smashed it through the top part of my window. At this point, the man slamming into the door stopped. I waited about 5 seconds and decided that I was not about to open my door. I made it to the window and cleared some of the broken glass out of the way. I climbed through it and placed my feet on the ledge of the building. The only way to safety was to the right of my office, towards the helicopter landing zone, which just happened to be right past the office I was trying to avoid. I slowly gripped the side of the building and made my way towards the landing. As I got to the window, I noticed that the blinds that were once closed were now open. With the daylight streaming in, I could see Cindy's mutilated body in more detail than I had previously. I had to force myself to keep going. I had just made it past the window when it felt like something had pierced my leg. I looked down, and there was the man in black, with his mouth attached to my right calf muscle. It felt as if he was transferring something into me. The next thing I knew, I felt weightless. I woke up 10 days later in the very hospital that I was so desperately trying to escape. My family was all gathered around my bed and could not believe it when I opened my eyes. Long story short, they found my supervisor's body in the office next to mine and found me laying in the back alley, surrounded by broken glass. I broke several bones and crushed a good portion of the back of my skull, resulting in me having issues with being able to speak. I kept trying to tell them it was the man in black, but nothing would come out of my mouth but blubbering noises. They told me that the police pulled up the security footage of that day. There was one clip of my boss and myself entering the office next to mine, and then the tape goes blank. Everyone thinks I killed her, and then tried to kill myself over the guilt of it. The whole time I'm being told this story, I can't help but take my eyes off the far corner of the room, where there is a huge mirror reflecting my image back to me. I am dressed in all black, laying in a bed of white sheets. My eyes are sunken into my head, and I can't stop smiling